Hello there guys, this is Christy Lillis from Dostoevsky in Space. Today I'm going to be talking about something that I haven't talked about for a long time on this channel. My all-time favorite fantasies and how they kind of show off my brand of fantasy, because I feel like it's not a brand that I see published very frequently these days, but I'm sure that they are out there, and I'm hoping maybe you guys can recommend me some that are my brand, because I am in a fantasy mood. I've just not been finding the right kinds. So let's jump into it. So the number one most important thing for me in my fantasy is the beautiful writing. It has to be beautiful. Writing is like especially important because it's related to the characterization and the setting and the atmosphere. And those are the next things that I care most about. And if the writing isn't good, then I'm not going to care to read about the setting because it's not like fun to physically read. So what I'm trying to say here, not very clearly, is the caliber of your writing will determine whether I understand and appreciate the world or the characters that you are describing, because really your ability to express those things is what will set your book apart. Like if your turn of phrase, just any phrase that you have on the page, to me is like a delight to read, then I'm much more likely to get through a super thick book. If you're good at describing things, then I'm probably gonna like your fantasy, because fantasy, like, really setting is what sets fantasy apart in so many ways. Because there's a reason that the author is setting it in a fantasy world, right? But if you can't write beautifully, then stylistically you're gonna be just like every other fantasy author out there. And it probably won't even have much atmosphere. And those things are all just like so important for my brand of fantasy. So I'm just going to tell you about some of my favorite books that fall under the writing is amazing category. Even if there are other things that I also really love about these books, it's primarily the writing that makes those things possible. So let's start off with Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones. She's actually quite a good plotter, but because she's writing it like a fairy tale, she, in the very opening page, just compares it to all these fairy tales, and that just grabs me so much. The humor in here is possible because of her writing. I would say that her writing is strong. It's not the strongest that's on my list, because again, I think primarily she's a plotter. She's a plot-heavy novelist. Her plots are very extremely intricate, but because she's a good writer, her characterization and her atmosphere really come through very strongly with this book. So I'll give you like brief descriptions of what these books are like. This is about the wizard Howl and a woman named Sophie who is cursed to be an old woman, and she goes to Howl to try and get uncursed, and she lives in his castle with him as his cleaning lady. And the humor in here is so great. It's very hectic, and the style just really sets it apart for me. Next, let's talk about The King of Attolia, and primarily the writing is so strong in this one. She chooses a narrator for this novel that's very brilliant, and that is what makes the novel take off. I think this whole series is really brilliant, but her style really contributes to her plotting, and altogether it's just a really wonderful historical fantasy series. So it's like sort of a Grecian setting, and you really get that feel for the setting in her books. And this is book 3 in this series, so I don't want to spoil the first book. The first book is called The Thief. The series is called The Queen's Thief. This one, so I'll try to describe it without spoilers. The thief of Eddis has fallen in love with a queen, and none of the queen's guards or protectors or anybody in the palace or even in the kingdom really likes him. They think he's basically a dirty thief. And so you're being told this story from the perspective of one of the queen's guard women, and just humiliating thing after humiliating thing happens to the thief as he seems to be trying to woo this queen. It really is kind of a love story, and there's a lot of strong characterization in here. It's just a really great series, so definitely check it out. I started with The Thief, but I didn't love the series until I read this one. I think it's fine to just pick this one up, honestly. You don't have to read them in order. Next, we have The Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe. The writing is really stellar in this, and it makes the setting stand out. It's really the setting that I love about these books, and the complexity of the thought. But without the patience that Gene Wolfe has in this book to set out his setting in such an interesting way, I feel like it would have fallen very flat. I'm in it for the ideas in the setting, but the writing makes it very accessible and it makes me slow down and pay attention to everything. Really a great series. Next, Harry Potter. Here's another one that you wouldn't necessarily say right off the bat, oh yeah, it's the writing, but really, in this first book, it's so atmospheric, and she really sets up the whole setting and makes the whole book just feel saturated with magic, and that is a skill of writing. We know that J.K. Rowling is a heavy plotter because she posted online at one point that she had plot outlines for her books, and so clearly she's a plot-heavy author, and her setting really sets her books apart. But I really think that it's her writing that brings it all together and gives you all the magical feels and the humor and the wonder. She writes with wonder, which I think is something that is generally shared by all of my favorites. There's a certain amount of wonder to them. Next, we have The Scorpio Races by Maggie Stiefvater. Now, this is actually a very setting-heavy book, but because the writing is so wonderful and lush, that's what makes the setting stand out. Like the food writing, I still make November cakes like every fall because it brings me back to this book. It's also a pretty plot heavy book. It's about a girl named Kate and a boy named Sean, and they are on this island called Thisbe where carnivorous horses come out of the sea. Kapelishka is what they're called from Scottish mythology. And these horses are captured and rounded up and raced every year, and they're usually very bloody affairs, but whoever wins, wins big. Kate has decided that she's going to ride her pony in the races to get enough money to save her house. And Sean is actually the repeat winner of this race, and he rides a Kapelishka. The Kapelishka are faster. It's going to be hard for a pony to beat the Kapelishka, but it becomes a race head-to-head between those two. So again, plot heavy, setting heavy, really wonderful, but the writing is what makes it so atmospheric and so addictive to me, and that's why I keep coming back to it. And I feel like she has very strong writing as well in like The Raven Boys, even stronger than this. It's really this book, I feel like, where her writing starts to show the promise that her later works will have, but I didn't really enjoy the whole series plot of The Raven Boys, unfortunately, and I haven't read any of her newest stuff. So I just really treasure this book because it's a standalone and I just really enjoy it. It's great on audiobook too. I didn't actually describe what the Book of the New Sun is about. So it's about a torturer named Severian who grew up in the Guild of Torturers, and he was raised to become a torturer, and what the torturers do is basically, if the autarch, who is the ruler, sends them a prisoner, he will lay out the kind of torture he wants, and the torturers take care of it for punishment or for information or whatever. And so Severian, at one point, when he is a young man and just coming into his torturing role as a torturer instead of an apprentice, he falls in love and finds that he cannot torture this woman. And so he ends up going on a quest that leads him to several places in the setting, and the setting again is really what makes it unique. It's very much a journey plot. So I would recommend this if you enjoy journey plots that are all about the setting, or if you just like literary kind of fantasy like this. Literary fantasy is kind of another buzzword for me. Although not so much modern literary fantasy, because a lot of times that is too bloody or sexual or whatever, but more like literary fantasy of the past. And actually this could be described as science fiction because it's very idea heavy as well. Next we have The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss, which is a book that I primarily care for because of the writing. Like there's really not really anything else about it that would have grabbed me so much without the writing. So I'm just happy for Patrick Rothfuss to take as much time as he needs to take to make sure that the final book is really beautiful. Because again, it wasn't the characters or the setting that grabbed me initially, although portions of it, like there's this portion of a plot that's inside of a library and inside of a university. You know, I love that portion of the plot, but none of that would have grabbed me as much without the beautiful writing. So it's absolutely essential for this book series. This is about a boy named Wolfe who grows up with a family of traveling musicians and actors, and kind of how he grows up trying to find the mystery of what happens to them, because it's really kind of unclear what happens to his family for a really long time in this book series. So he's just on a journey to find out what happened. There's some kind of mythology coming to life in this book, and there's just so many mysteries that we don't really know yet, and all of that is very much heightened by the writing. The writing is what gives it so much atmosphere, because otherwise it would be a very slow plot, and the characterization doesn't really kick in for quite a long time into this book series. So writing all the way. Next I want to talk about Susanna Clark, because her writing in Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell and Piranesi is the primary reason, again, why I love her books. They have such a strong atmosphere and humor to them. The writing really brings out the setting and the characters, but really it's all about the atmosphere. So this is about two wizards who are reviving the use of magic in England during the Napoleonic Wars, and it's kind of like the consequences of using magic in their personal lives. What happens because of their use of magic? Next we have The Blue Sword and The Hero and the Crown by Robin McKinley. These are two young adult fantasies, and they're like considered classics of the genre. And again, the writing is really what carries these. I don't even remember very much about them, so I should probably reread them sometime. But I just remember that I enjoyed reading every word, and I felt like the setting really came to life. And I felt like I was in the hands of a master storyteller as I was reading these. It reminds me a lot of Tamora Pierce's early Tortallon fantasies, which I should probably talk about, but a little bit later. So The Chronicles of Narnia as well. This is another one where the atmosphere is just the main priority, and the writing really pulls that through. It gives me the same feeling as Harry Potter. It's a very magical feeling in The Chronicles of Narnia. So in The Blue Sword and The Hero and the Crown, it's about two lady knights going on various quests, and they're actually separated by I think several hundred years, but they're a part of the same kingdom. And they actually, the one who is later actually has heard myths of the one who is in the former one. So for The Chronicles of Narnia, each book has a very unique setting and plot. And this is also a very strong idea series. It has a lot of good ideas in it. And it's all conveyed through the writing. And it's that consistent magical feel that I think has captured the hearts of so many readers of The Chronicles of Narnia. So let's move on to setting. As I said, I already mentioned that, you know, these are all setting books, The Chronicles of Narnia. Strong settings. I mean, that's kind of like a given in fantasy. It kind of has to have a strong setting, right? But the writing has to be on par for me to even notice or care. And then we have characters that I care about. Now, I want to talk briefly here about Tamora Pierce, because I was so addicted to her early Tortallon fantasy series when I was a kid, because I just would fall in love with these main characters. So this one is the Protector of the Small series, and I would say you could do really well starting with the Squire books. It's a little bit more adult than the previous two books in the series, and this is where I started and I was totally hooked. So this is following a girl who is trying to be a lady knight in a kingdom where she will be the first girl going through the system that everybody knows she's trying to become a knight. Her predecessor, Lady Knight, is a different series where it's a girl who disguised herself as a boy to go through the system, and after she did that and became friends with the prince while she was becoming a knight, they decided to change things so that females could go through the system and become knights. And this is the first girl in like 10 years who actually wanted to try it and whose parents would let her. So Kell is just such a steady character, which I think is a characteristic that often isn't in main characters anymore. She's just like steady and quiet and hardworking and doesn't complain and just makes her own mark. And I really think that she's a wonderful personality. Caladria of Mindolin is her name, but also the setting comes to life so well in these early books. Here she's holding a griffin and she talks with these birds because there's a wild mage from this series who is making the animals more human-like. They can actually communicate with humans. So I really would recommend this series very highly. And also the Wild Magic series. This was, I think, maybe the first series with a romance in it that I really loved. And I think that really enthralled me as a kid. Whereas this one, there isn't really romance, but she goes through, you know, having crushes and having all the female problems that come along with growing up and being female. All well in a very male field. So Caladri's, I think, was the third series, and so you can really tell that she's matured in her writing by this series. But I think there's so many amazing ideas in this series, and the setting, the Wild Magic series, and the characterization and the romance. So strong, so good. So the original books that she wrote that you probably might have actually heard of is the Lioness Quartet, which is following Alanna. Alanna is the girl who disguised herself to become a knight. And finally, I want to talk about The Way of Kings and Elantris and Mistborn. I can't hold these because they're too heavy, but they're so beautiful. So Brandon Sanderson I like primarily because of his ideas. So ideas is something that I usually find more in science fiction that I'm drawn to. It's very important in science fiction. But I think something that is really unique to Brandon Sanderson and to some writers of faith like Gene Wolfe, for example, or C.S. Lewis, is that they can write about faith in ways that are not offensive to the majority of the religious world. I mean, the majority of people on this earth are religious in some way. I know that publishing wouldn't have you understand that because I feel like modern American publishing and a lot of European publishing, you know, these days, people aren't religious in the writing community. But the fact is most people are religious, and I think it's very important for you to be able to represent religious people in a good way. And so when I find an author who can do that, it's like, it's such a treat for me because I find it to be so rare in modern publishing, and Brandon Sanderson can do that. He writes religions in such a way that it's interesting, it's critical, it's not offensive, and I think part of that is because he is a religious man. So I really just appreciate that in his stories so much, and his stories are primarily character driven is what he calls them, but they have great ideas, they have amazing settings, the characters are so lovable and deep that I think he has a lot of talent, even though his writing is really nothing special. It's basically just clear. It's very clear what he means all the time, which, you know, that can be hard enough, right? But I really appreciate his stories. I'm not gonna give you all synopsises of them, but I do have a series called Storm Along on this channel if you're interested, where we have long discussions of the Way of Kings, the Words of Radiance, Oathbringer, and we didn't have any of Rhythm of War, but we had like hour-long plus discussions of each of them. 5 for each book, I think it was, or 4. So yeah, it's really, if you want to check those out, that was really a good time. Another author who was very interesting in the idea realm is Madeleine L'Engle. I really love her A Wrinkle in Time. Actually, the next 2 books after this are the most interesting idea-wise to me, but A Wrinkle in Time is the one that everybody fell in love with. It's about Meg, who is a kind of a math whiz, and she ends up traveling through the stars to try and find her father, who has disappeared, in search of a tesseract, and a tesseract is the wrinkle in time. So it's basically about time travel. And then the next 2 books in this series they get weird, but it's like theologically interesting and just interesting as science fiction. So this is almost more science fiction-y, but I would still classify it maybe as fantasy. I don't know. So maybe this would be better classified as science fiction now that I'm thinking about it, but yeah. So that's a great series. And I forgot to talk about the Abhorsen books by Garth Nix, which is another series that I would say is, the writing is really gorgeous and it really supports the characterization and the setting and the plotting. Like, I think this is really the whole package. I think Garth Nix's Abhorsen Chronicles is really the whole package, but the writing is really what drew me in. I think I just love to sit down and get absorbed in these worlds, and his writing is just really, really nice. So this is following several different girls who become necromancers, I think is the word that you would use for them, but they don't actually raise people from the dead. They actually try to banish people back to the dead who have been brought to life again and shouldn't be. So pretty much she's trying to put people to rest who need to be put to rest. That's what I'm remembering, but it's been a while since I've read these. So anyways, really, really a wonderful series. Highly recommend. And next for ideas, and usually with strong ideas, I need really strong pacing as well because otherwise I get bored. And Watership Down by Richard Adams is one of those books that I could not put down. It's actually about a series of rabbits who, one of the rabbits had a vision of just blood, and so he tries to lead a bunch of his friends away from their warren to find another warren, and it's really about their journey to set up another warren basically. And the pacing was so good, the plotting was like, I was so drawn in, but really it's about the ideas. It's a really well-researched book about rabbits, and I'm not normally a talking animal like huge fan, like that's not something that I normally read about, but these were so like interesting and realistic in the way that he thought about everything, how the rabbits communicate and how they think about like roads and cars and stuff. He has a lot of like onomatopoeia for the names that animals have. So anyways, My battery's about to run out, so I've gotta go, but let me know down below if you have any recommendations for me, and thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you next time. Bye.